Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mysterious world of when did humans start, using mushrooms. A story filled with whispers of power, betrayal, and secrets the old world tried to bury. There are moments in history that make you wonder how far humans could go for pride, for greed, or for survival, and this one is among them. So before you settle in, take a deep breath, dim the lights, maybe let the soft hum of your fan fill the room. And if you truly enjoy calm but dark storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see who's joining us on these late-night journeys through forgotten history. Now let's drift back in time together. The winds howled a mournful tune across the desolate plains of Eldoria, carrying with them the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was an age steeped in shadow, where the common folk toiled beneath the oppressive gaze of their lords, and the whispers of ancient magic still clung to the gnarled branches of the oldest forests. In this grim tapestry of medieval life, knowledge was a dangerous weapon, and those who dared to seek it often met with cruel fates. Our story begins not with kings or queens, but with a humble healer, Ilara, who lived on the fringes of society, her wisdom born not from scrolls, but from the silent teachings of the earth itself. She knew the language of the plants, the secrets of the herbs, and the subtle power that lay hidden within the unassuming fungi that sprouted in the deepest, most shadowed corners of the woods. It was said that long before the great houses of Eldoria rose to power, before the castles cast their long shadows over the land, humanity had a different relationship with the natural world. They were not its masters, but its children, reliant on its bounty and respectful of its mysteries. Ilara often pondered this, her fingers tracing the delicate gills of a wild mushroom, a faint glow emanating from it in the twilight. The village elders spoke of a time when the earth's flesh, as they called mushrooms, were understood differently, not just as food or poison, but as something more profound. But those tales were now dismissed as mere folklore, dangerous pagan ramblings in an era dominated by rigid dogma and the iron fist of the church. King Thuron, a man whose heart was as cold and unyielding as the stone of his fortress, ruled Eldoria with an iron grip. His decrees were law, his whims were absolute, and dissent was met with swift, brutal punishment. He was a glutton for power, a man who believed that all knowledge not sanctioned by him was heresy, and those who practiced it were witches, worthy only of the pyre. His queen, Isolde, was a pale, fragile woman, kept cloistered in the castle, her spirit crushed by her husband's cruelty and the suffocating etiquette of the court. She often looked out of her high window, yearning for the freedom of the forests, for the simple life she had known before her forced marriage to the tyrannical king. Ilara, with her quiet understanding of the natural world, was a thorn in the side of the established order. She healed the sick when the court physicians failed, her remedies often involving strange brews and poultices made from things gathered from the forest floor. Her reputation, though whispered with respect by the commoners, was viewed with suspicion by the king's men. They saw her as a potential threat, a beacon of independent thought that could ignite rebellion amongst the downtrodden. It was only a matter of time before their paths would inevitably cross. One bitter winter, a mysterious plague swept through the kingdom, sparing neither peasant nor noble. The king's own son, young Prince Kaelin, was afflicted, his body racked with fever, his breath growing shallow. The court physicians, pompous men in elaborate robes, tried every known remedy, every prayer, every incantation, but the prince only worsened. Desperation gnawed at King Thuron's heart, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to experience. His arrogance, however, remained untarnished. He would not stoop to consult a common village healer, not openly at least. But Queen Isolde, driven by a mother's fierce love and a quiet defiance, secretly sent one of her most trusted handmaidens, a girl named Lyra, to seek out Alara. Lyra, a timid girl, ventured into the snow-laden woods, guided by hushed whispers and faint tracks, until she found Alara's secluded cottage, nestled deep amongst the ancient oaks. The air within was warm, fragrant with herbs, and filled with a calm energy that soothed Lyra's frayed nerves. Alara listened patiently, her eyes keen and ancient, absorbing every detail of the prince's illness. She spoke of a rare mushroom, one that grew only in the deepest, most sacred parts of the Wailing Woods, a place shunned by most due to tales of spirits and ancient guardians. This particular fungus, she explained, possessed properties that could combat the plague's insidious grip, but it was also incredibly potent, and its preparation required precise knowledge and careful handling. A wrong dosage, and it could be as deadly as the plague itself. It was a perilous journey, and Alara knew that gathering it herself would draw unwanted attention. Instead, she instructed Lyra on how to identify it, detailing its unique iridescent cap and the way it glowed faintly in the dark. She gave Lyra a small, hand-drawn map and a pouch of protective herbs, warning her of the dangers and the necessity of absolute secrecy. The king, Alara said, her voice soft but firm, must never know the true source of this healing. He would see it as witchcraft, not medicine. Lyra, terrified but resolute, nodded. The fate of the prince, and perhaps the stability of the kingdom, rested on her slender shoulders. Lyra's journey into the Wailing Woods was fraught with peril. The ancient trees seemed to watch her, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, and the wind whispered chilling tales through the pines. But her determination to save the prince and to honor Alara's trust propelled her forward. She finally found the clearing Alara had described, and there, beneath the roots of a giant, moss-covered oak, was a cluster of mushrooms, their caps shimmering with an otherworldly glow. They were beautiful, yet held a subtle menace. She carefully harvested them, wrapped them in damp leaves as instructed, and hastened back to Alara's cottage. Alara immediately began her work, grinding the mushrooms into a paste with other herbs, chanting softly, her movements precise and deliberate. The concoction, when finished, was a thick, dark liquid that smelled faintly of earth and something indefinable, ancient. Alara entrusted it to Lyra, along with strict instructions on its administration to the ailing prince. Back at the castle, the atmosphere was grim. The king sat by his son's bedside, his face etched with a rare flicker of despair. Queen Isolde, her eyes red from weeping, anxiously awaited Lyra's return. When Lyra finally slipped into the chamber, carrying the small vial, Isolde's hope flared. Without hesitation, she administered the medicine to Kaelin, despite the lingering fear of the king's wrath should it fail, or worse, be discovered to be from an unorthodox source. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Prince Kaelin began to recover. The fever broke, his breathing eased, and a faint color returned to his cheeks. Within days, he was sitting up, weak but alive. The court physicians, baffled and humbled, attributed it to a miraculous turn of divine favor. King Thuron, overjoyed at his son's recovery, also accepted this explanation, his arrogance preventing him from questioning the true nature of the miracle. He even ordered a grand feast in celebration, claiming it was his unwavering faith that had saved his heir. Queen Isolde, however, knew the truth. She met secretly with Lyra, who recounted her perilous journey and Alara's unwavering dedication. Isolde was deeply grateful, but also troubled. She knew the dangers Alara faced. The king's laws against witchcraft were absolute, and his spies were everywhere. Any hint of Alara's involvement would lead to her swift execution. So a silent pact was formed between the queen, Lyra, and Alara. The secret of the mushroom's power and its source would remain buried. For a time, peace settled over the land, or at least a semblance of it. King Thuron, feeling invincible after his son's recovery, grew even more tyrannical. His taxes became heavier, his punishments more severe, and the lives of the common folk grew increasingly miserable. He believed himself touched by divine power, beyond reproach, beyond accountability. He seized lands from minor nobles on flimsy pretexts, filling his coffers and expanding his already vast power. His court, filled with sycophants and yes-men, echoed his every cruel decree. One such decree was particularly heinous, a law that allowed nobles to claim any peasant's land if they found a single, unapproved plant growing on it, deeming it evidence of pagan practices. This law was a thinly veiled excuse for land grabs, leading to countless families being dispossessed and thrown into destitution. It was a clear abuse of power, designed to further enrich the already wealthy and crush any remaining spirit of defiance among the commoners. Alara, from her quiet cottage, witnessed the escalating injustice with a heavy heart. She saw families she had known for generations cast out, their homes burned, their lives shattered. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, fueled by desperation and righteous anger, but they were quickly suppressed by the king's brutal enforcers. It seemed there was no hope, no way to challenge the king's absolute authority. Then a new sickness began to spread, far more insidious than the plague that had struck Prince Kaelin. It was a creeping madness, affecting those in the king's inner circle first, then spreading to the broader court. The afflicted would suffer from vivid hallucinations, terrifying nightmares, and a gradual descent into violent paranoia. The court physicians were, once again, helpless. They blamed it on evil spirits, on a curse, anything but their own ignorance. King Thuron, ever superstitious despite his outward show of piety, grew increasingly terrified. He saw his trusted advisors turn against each other, his most loyal guards descend into gibbering lunacy. He became obsessed with finding the source and punishing those responsible. His paranoia reached a fever pitch. He suspected everyone, even Queen Isolde, of plotting against him. His rule became even more unstable, his decrees more erratic and cruel. He ordered widespread arrests, dragging innocent people to the dungeons, accusing them of witchcraft and treason. Queen Isolde, observing her husband's unraveling, felt a chilling realization. This madness, this strange affliction, it bore a striking resemblance to some of the cautionary tales Alara had shared about certain potent, mind-altering mushrooms. Not the healing kind, but the ones that twisted the mind, that opened pathways to visions both terrifying and beautiful, and when misused, led to profound mental disarray. She remembered Alara's warnings about the fine line between medicine and madness, between beneficial fungi and dangerous ones. Could someone be deliberately poisoning the court? Or had the king, in his unchecked arrogance, somehow stumbled upon these dangerous fungi himself, perhaps in some ill-advised attempt to find a cure or a truth serum, without understanding their true nature. The thought sent shivers down her spine. The king, in his desperate search for power and control, had always been reckless. It was a dark, dangerous game of manipulation and fear that had consumed Eldoria. She secretly sent Lyra to Alara again, not for healing, but for understanding. Lyra, braver now, navigated the increasingly dangerous roads, dodging the king's patrols, until she reached Alara's cottage. Alara, her face etched with a deep sorrow, confirmed Isolde's suspicions. She had heard the whispers from the common folk, stories of nobles behaving erratically, of strange visions and terrifying outbursts. She believed that someone, perhaps even the king himself, was inadvertently or deliberately misusing a specific kind of mushroom. There were certain fungi, Alara explained, that induced powerful visions, used by ancient peoples in sacred rituals, but lethal in the wrong hands or when consumed without proper guidance. These were the spirit walkers, capable of unlocking the mind's hidden depths or shattering it completely. She suspected that either a disgruntled member of the court, seeking to destabilize the king, was slipping these into the food or drink, or the king, in his blind ambition, had tried to harness their power for his own ends, without the understanding to wield such a potent tool. The thought of such powerful fungi being weaponized or accidentally unleashed filled Isolde with dread. It wasn't just the king's downfall she feared now, but the complete unraveling of society, the descent into chaos that this madness could bring. She knew that the king's current state made him vulnerable, but also infinitely more dangerous. His paranoia would lead him to destroy anything and anyone he perceived as a threat. She had to act. But how could she, a queen trapped in a gilded cage, challenge a king whose mind was rapidly deteriorating and whose power was still absolute? She realized that to save Eldoria, the king's reign had to end, and with it, the cycle of cruelty and injustice. But she could not overtly rebel. That would mean certain death for herself and Lyra, and perhaps even her son. She needed a way to expose the truth, to reveal the king's madness for what it was, and to show the court that his rule was no longer divinely sanctioned, but utterly corrupted. Isolde began to observe the king closely, noticing his increasingly agitated behavior, his rapid mood swings. She saw him speaking to unseen figures, his eyes wide with terror or maniacal glee. She also noticed a faint, earthy smell clinging to his chambers, a scent that was subtly familiar from Lyra's descriptions of Alara's herbs and mushrooms. It was a clue, a faint trail that hinted at the truth. One night during a particularly unsettling court dinner, the king began to rave, accusing his most loyal knight, Sir Calmest, of plotting against him. He drew his sword, his eyes blazing with madness, threatening to strike down Sir Calmest in front of the horrified court. The courtiers shrank back, terrified. It was a moment of stark revelation for many. Their king was truly lost. Isolde, seeing her opportunity, stood up, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "My lord," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "your mind is clouded not by treason but by a deeper affliction." She then turned to the court. "The king is not well. He has been touched by a malady that twists the perceptions, that warps reality." The king, momentarily distracted by her boldness, turned his enraged gaze upon her. "Silence, woman. You dare question your king?" "I dare to speak the truth, for the good of Eldoria," Isolde retorted, finding an inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. "This madness that grips our court, it is not a curse, but the doing of a certain fungus, a powerful mushroom, misused and misunderstood. She then dramatically produced a small, dried piece of the very mushroom Alara had warned about, one she had managed to subtly collect from the king's private chambers, hidden in a forgotten pouch. This is what afflicts our king. Its power, when wielded without knowledge or respect, can unravel the very fabric of the mind. A gasp rippled through the court. The piece of dried mushroom, though small, had a distinctive, almost ethereal quality. Some recognized it from old tales, others merely recoiled in fear. Isolde continued, her voice gaining strength. For too long, our king has persecuted those with true knowledge of the earth, those who understand its gifts and its dangers. He has silenced healers like Alara, who saved our own son's life with the benevolent power of the earth, deeming her wisdom witchcraft. Now, his own arrogance has led him to this precipice. The king, enraged, lunged at Isolde, but Sir Kaelan, recovering from his shock, bravely stepped in the way, shielding the queen. Other knights, seeing the king's true madness, and touched by Isolde's courage, began to stir, their loyalties shifting. The scene devolved into chaos, the lines of authority blurring as the king's personal guard, also affected by the madness, fought amongst themselves. The common people, who had gathered outside the castle walls, drawn by the commotion and the spreading rumors of the king's madness, began to surge forward. The harsh laws, the cruel punishments, the injustice, it all came crashing down around King Thuron. The seeds of rebellion, sown by his own tyranny, finally blossomed into open revolt. The king, in his delirious state, was overwhelmed, his power crumbling under the weight of his own misdeeds and the very earth's flesh he had unknowingly abused. In the ensuing chaos, King Thuron was apprehended, not by loyal guards, but by a coalition of disaffected nobles and commoners, all united by their shared suffering under his cruel reign. He was stripped of his crown, his power, and his sanity. He was confined to a secluded tower, where he continued to rave about unseen enemies and grand conspiracies, forever lost in the hallucinatory world created by the very fungi he had either sought to exploit or had accidentally ingested. Queen Isolde, with the support of the now united nobles and the grateful populace, assumed the regency until Prince Kaelan was old enough to rule. Her first act was to repeal the unjust laws, to release the innocent from the dungeons, and to seek out Alara, offering her a place of honor and respect within the kingdom. Alara, ever humble, declined a place at court, preferring her quiet life in the woods, but she became a revered advisor, her knowledge of the natural world, including the complex and often dangerous world of mushrooms, finally valued and understood. Aldoria slowly began to heal. The people learned a painful but vital lesson. True power lay not in oppression, but in understanding, respect, and wisdom. The arrogance of rulers, their refusal to acknowledge knowledge beyond their own narrow worldview, could lead to devastating consequences. The story of King Thuron became a cautionary tale, whispered around hearths for generations, a grim reminder of what happens when power is abused and wisdom is scorned. And Alara, the quiet healer, continued her work, tending to the earth and its secrets. She understood that humans had always interacted with mushrooms, from the earliest days, as food, as medicine, as sacred tools, and sometimes as agents of chaos. The key, she knew, was not to fear their power, but to understand it, to respect the delicate balance of nature, and to never, ever mistake knowledge for mere control. The earth held profound lessons, if only humans were humble enough to listen. The downfall of King Thuron served as a brutal, unforgettable testament to this ancient truth. The whispers of the forest carried tales of those who truly listened, and those who foolishly tried to dominate. It was a slow, deliberate lesson, etched into the very soil of Eldoria. The passage of seasons brought about noticeable changes in Eldoria. The oppressive atmosphere under King Thuron had slowly dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and a cautious optimism. Queen Isolde, with her gentle yet firm hand, guided the kingdom towards a future where justice was not a fleeting whisper, but a foundational pillar. Her decrees focused on rebuilding, on mending the deep wounds left by her predecessor's cruelty. The fields, once abandoned by dispossessed peasants, were returned to their rightful owners, and the once feared king's guards were repurposed as guardians of peace, their training now emphasizing protection rather than suppression. Yet the shadow of the past, though receding, never fully vanished. The memory of the king's madness, the strange affliction that had twisted his mind, served as a constant, stark reminder of the delicate balance between power and responsibility, between ignorance and wisdom. It solidified Queen Isolde's commitment to fostering a deeper understanding of the natural world, a concept that had been utterly dismissed as pagan heresy during Thuron's tyrannical reign. She understood, thanks to Alara, that true strength lay in knowledge, not in brute force or blind faith. Alara, from her quiet sanctuary, continued to be a guiding light. She never sought fame or power, content with her life in the forest, nurturing her herbs and studying the intricate tapestry of nature. But her wisdom was now openly sought. Scholars from the newly established academies, encouraged by Queen Isolde, would often venture to her cottage, eager to learn about the properties of plants, and yes, even the mysterious fungi that had played such a pivotal role in Eldoria's recent history. Alara, with infinite patience, shared her knowledge, teaching them the subtle differences between the life-giving and the mind-altering, the nourishing and the deadly. She taught them reverence, a concept largely lost in an age of conquest and control. She spoke of how ancient humans, long before the elaborate castles and intricate social structures, had lived in much closer harmony with their surroundings. They had observed, experimented, and learned through generations of intimate interaction with the land. Mushrooms, she explained, were not merely a source of food or poison, but held deeper significance. Some were used in rituals to connect with the spirit world, to induce visions that guided tribal decisions, or to help shamans understand the nature of illness. Others were potent medicines, capable of alleviating pain, healing wounds, or combating virulent diseases. But always, she stressed, with respect and understanding. The downfall of King Thuron served as a brutal, unforgettable testament to this ancient truth. His arrogance had blinded him to the subtle powers around him, leading him to either unwittingly consume or attempt to exploit a force he could not comprehend. The kingdom's recovery became a living monument to the principle that ignoring nature's wisdom came at a terrible price. The new laws Queen Isolde enacted were designed not just to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent the conditions that bred such tyranny, laws that valued justice, protected the vulnerable, and encouraged learning. A crucial change was the establishment of forest preserves, areas where the ancient trees and rare plants, including various species of fungi, were protected from wanton destruction. These preserves were not just for nature's sake, but for the sake of knowledge. They became living laboratories, where scholars and apprentices, under Alara's distant guidance, could study the earth's bounty, understanding its cycles and its inherent power. It was a stark contrast to the old ways, where forests were seen merely as resources to be exploited or dark places to be feared. Prince Kalen, now growing into a thoughtful and compassionate young man, spent many hours in these preserves. His mother, Queen Isolde, ensured he was educated not only in statecraft and warfare, but also in the ways of the earth. He learned from the scholars who had learned from Ilara, absorbing the lessons of the past, understanding the fragile ecosystem of his kingdom. He walked among the ancient trees, his eyes open to the delicate beauty of a glowing mushroom, seeing it not as a source of fear or superstition, but as a part of the grand design of nature. His education included the detailed history of the Earth's flesh, as Ilara still called them. He learned that humans had indeed been using mushrooms since time immemorial, long before written history, long before the first stone castle was ever conceived. Paleolithic cave paintings sometimes depicted figures adorned with mushroom-like symbols, suggesting their early spiritual significance. Archaeological digs in various ancient sites had unearthed evidence of mushroom consumption, both for sustenance and for ritualistic purposes. He learned of the stone eaters of the distant past, ancient peoples who, when faced with starvation, had learned to differentiate between edible and poisonous fungi, a knowledge passed down through generations. He heard tales of vision seekers, who used specific mushrooms to induce trance-like states, believing they could communicate with ancestors or glimpse the future. These were not mere myths in Eldoria anymore, but recognized facets of human history, studied with respect and scientific curiosity, rather than fear. The story of King Thuron, however, remained the most potent lesson. It highlighted the devastating consequences when this ancient knowledge was forgotten or twisted. His pride had prevented him from seeking true understanding, leading him to a path of self-destruction and almost the destruction of his entire kingdom. His arrogance, his belief that he was above the natural order, had been his ultimate undoing. The very fungi he had perhaps consumed in his desperate search for ultimate power had instead shown him the fragility of his own mind. One day, Lyra, now a trusted advisor to Queen Isolde and a skilled herbalist in her own right, was walking with Prince Kalen through the Wailing Woods, the very place she had once feared. She pointed out a patch of the iridescent mushrooms that had saved the prince's life years ago. "These," she said, her voice soft, "are a gift and a warning. A gift of healing, but a warning of how easily power can corrupt, especially when misunderstood." Kalen knelt, gently touching the glowing cap of a mushroom. "And how many other gifts," he pondered aloud, "have we ignored or feared simply because we lacked the wisdom to understand them?" His words echoed the very lesson his mother and Ilara had striven to instill in the kingdom. It was a lesson about humility, about seeking knowledge with an open mind, and about respecting the intricate web of life that sustained them all. The new era in Eldoria was not without its challenges. There were still disagreements, still moments of tension between the various noble houses, and the ever-present threat of external kingdoms. But now, the leadership faced these challenges with a foundation of understanding and a commitment to justice that had been absent for so long. The cruelty and injustice of the past, the power abuse and torture under King Thuron, were not forgotten, but actively worked against. The memory of the tortures inflicted, the arbitrary arrests, the public humiliations, these dark stains on Eldoria's history were acknowledged, and institutions were put in place to ensure such abuses would never happen again. Laws were reformed, courts were made fairer, and the common people were given a voice, albeit a quiet one at first, in the governance of their own lives. It was a slow, arduous process, but it was one driven by the hard-earned wisdom of the queen and the unwavering, silent guidance of the forest healer. The moral of this long, winding tale of kings and healers, of power and mushrooms, was etched into the very stones of Eldoria's rebuilt towns and the hearts of its people. Arrogance and ignorance, especially in those who wield great power, are a potent recipe for downfall. True wisdom lies not in control and domination, but in understanding, respect, and the humble recognition of one's place within the vast, complex tapestry of the natural world. The earth provides, it teaches, and it punishes, often with quiet, undeniable force. And sometimes, the smallest, most unassuming organism, like a humble mushroom, can be the catalyst for the greatest changes, for both good and ill. The humans of Eldoria, after a long period of darkness, had finally begun to truly use mushrooms, not just as a resource, but as a teacher, a symbol of profound knowledge that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. The memory of King Thuron's downfall, a spectacle of madness fueled by his own paranoia, lingered like a chilling mist over Eldoria. Queen Isolde, now the undisputed ruler, faced the daunting task of stitching a fractured kingdom back together. The nobles, still reeling from the Feast of Allegiance, were a mixture of relief and lingering suspicion. The peasants, though freed from the immediate terror of the truth draft, carried the scars of fear and injustice deep within their hearts. Isolde, however, was not her husband. She understood that true power lay not in crushing dissent, but in fostering trust and healing wounds. Her first act was to establish a royal council, not of sycophants, but of wise men and women chosen for their integrity and judgment, regardless of their noble lineage. Among them, to the astonishment of many, was Ilara, the peasant girl from Oakhaven. Isolde recognized Ilara's unique wisdom, her deep understanding of the natural world, and her unwavering courage. Ilara was given the title of royal herbalist and advisor, a position that blurred the ancient lines between commoner and noble, a bold move that signaled a new era. The castle of Stonehaven, once a symbol of tyrannical fear, slowly began to transform. The grim dungeons, where so many had suffered under Thuron's cruel laws, were emptied and repurposed. Some sections were even converted into libraries and healing centers, a stark contrast to their previous use. Isolde commissioned scholars and healers to study the remaining spirit caps, not for their truth-revealing properties, but to understand their medicinal applications and, more importantly, to develop effective antidotes for those still suffering from their lingering effects. Alaric, the former royal alchemist, his mind sharpened by his own imprisonment and remorse, surprisingly proved invaluable in this endeavor. He worked tirelessly, driven by a desire to atone for his unwitting complicity in the king's madness. But healing a kingdom was a slow, arduous process. The memory of odd laws, like the Truth Draft Decree, or the lesser-known but equally cruel Whisper Ban that had outlawed any private conversation exceeding 3 minutes among peasants, still haunted the common folk. Under Thuron, even a casual chat could be twisted into a treasonous plot, and suspected violations were met with public floggings. The arbitrary nature of justice under his rule had bred deep-seated distrust, making it difficult for people to believe in a benevolent ruler. Queen Isolde actively worked to dismantle these cruelties. She sent royal emissaries throughout the kingdom, not with decrees of punishment, but with messages of reassurance. They brought aid to famine-stricken villages, established fair courts where commoners could seek justice against unscrupulous nobles, and abolished all unjust taxes and forced labor. One of her most celebrated reforms was the Forest Decree, which granted peasants certain rights to gather resources from the royal forests without fear of arbitrary punishment, a direct reversal of Thuron's draconian hunting and gathering laws that had often led to peasants being tortured for poaching a rabbit. This period of transition, though marked by hope, was not without its challenges. Some of the old, arrogant nobles, accustomed to their unchecked power, resisted Isolde's reforms. They saw her compassion as weakness, her reforms as an erosion of their rightful privileges. A particularly vocal opponent was Duke Randall, a man known for his vast landholdings and his particularly harsh treatment of his serfs. Randall openly sneered at Alara's presence on the council, calling it an insult to the noble bloodline. Duke Randall, clinging to the old ways, continued to enforce his own brutal laws on his estates, defying the Queen's new mandates. He maintained his private dungeons, where peasants were often tortured for trivial offenses or merely to satisfy his sadistic whims. Whispers of these continued abuses reached Queen Isolde, who understood that her new reign's legitimacy hinged on her ability to curb such defiance. Isolde decided to make an example, but not with the swift, brutal force her husband would have employed. She sought justice, not vengeance. She dispatched a royal commission, led by Alara, to investigate Duke Randall's estate. Alara, with her quiet authority and deep understanding of the common folk, gathered testimonies from Randall's suffering serfs, documenting the extent of his cruelty, the arbitrary punishments, the prolonged tortures in his dungeons. When the evidence was undeniable, Queen Isolde summoned Duke Randall to Stonehaven. In a public trial, before the newly constituted royal court, Alara presented the detailed accounts of Randall's abuses. The Duke, arrogant and defiant, scoffed at the testimony, dismissing the serfs as lying wretches. He even dared to mock Alara, calling her a forest mushroom who had no place in matters of state. But Isolde, with a calm authority that brooked no argument, heard the evidence. She pronounced Randall guilty of gross injustice, of defying royal decrees, and of crimes against the people of Eldoria. His lands were confiscated, his titles stripped, and he was sentenced not to death, but to spend the rest of his days working alongside the very serfs he had brutalized, forced to experience the harsh realities of the life he had so casually inflicted upon others. It was a punishment more fitting, more poetic than any execution, for it forced him to confront the consequences of his own cruelty. The downfall of Duke Randall sent a clear message throughout the kingdom. The days of unchecked noble power and arbitrary cruelty were over. Isolde's justice was firm but fair, a stark contrast to Thuron's capricious tyranny. This act solidified the Queen Regent's authority and began to slowly restore faith in the crown. The kingdom flourished under Queen Isolde's gentle but firm hand. Trade routes reopened, villages rebuilt, and the arts and sciences, stifled under Thuron's paranoid rule, began to thrive again. Alara, the royal herbalist, dedicated herself to studying the beneficial properties of other forest plants, developing new medicines, and expanding the knowledge of natural healing. The spirit caps, while still strictly forbidden for consumption, were now understood as a powerful symbol, a reminder of how something seemingly innocuous could be twisted into a tool of oppression, and how easily power could corrupt. The children of Eldoria grew up hearing the tale of King Thuron, the mushrooms that twisted his mind, and the queen who brought light back to the kingdom. It became a cautionary tale, whispered around hearth fires, a lesson about the dangers of arrogance, the intoxicating lure of absolute power, and the importance of empathy and justice. They learned that true strength lay not in domination, but in understanding, not in control, but in compassion. And so, mushrooms in Eldoria returned to their place beyond the dinner plate, yet forever changed. They were no longer just food, but a living reminder of a time when their silent power had almost undone a kingdom. They symbolized the hidden depths of nature, capable of both sustenance and peril, and a mirror to the human soul itself, capable of both great good and terrible darkness. The lesson resonated through generations. Even the most humble of things can become a catalyst for immense change, and sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones we refuse to see within ourselves. The quiet wisdom of the forest, once ignored by kings, had spoken, and Eldoria had finally listened, choosing a path of hope and humanity over fear and tyranny. The journey was long, the wounds deep, but the sun, at last, truly shone upon a kingdom reborn, guided by a queen who understood that true leadership meant serving, not merely ruling. The year was 1347, in the sprawling, fertile lands of the kingdom of Eldoria, a place of deep green forests, winding rivers and villages nestled in valleys, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the sun and the seasons. For generations, mushrooms were simply a part of the forest's bounty, gathered by peasants, cooked in stews, and sometimes dried for winter. They were food, nothing more, a humble offering from the earth that sustained the common folk through lean times. The nobles, with their roasted meats and fine wines, barely gave them a second glance, considering them fare for the less fortunate. King Thuron, a man of immense girth and even more immense pride, ruled Eldoria with an iron fist. His decrees were law, his whims were commandments, and dissent was met with swift, brutal punishment. His castle, Stonehaven, loomed over the capital, a fortress of gray stone and cold ambition, where the laughter of jesters often masked the cries of the condemned. Queen Isolde, his sharp-witted wife, moved through its halls like a shadow, her influence subtle but ever-present, her ambition a silent counterpoint to her husband's boisterous tyranny. In the small, forgotten village of Oakhaven, nestled deep within the Eldorian forest, lived Elara, a young woman with eyes the color of moss after a spring rain, and a spirit as resilient as the ancient oaks surrounding her home. She was a gatherer, a seeker of herbs and roots, trained by her grandmother in the quiet wisdom of the woods. Mushrooms were her particular specialty. She knew their secrets, their dangers, and their subtle gifts. She understood that not all fungi were merely food. Some held power, some held peril, and some held the very essence of dreams. One crisp autumn morning, as the mist still clung to the forest floor, Elara stumbled upon a patch of mushrooms unlike any she had ever seen. They pulsed with a faint, ethereal glow, a soft violet light that seemed to hum in the silent woods. Her grandmother had spoken of such fungi in hushed tones, ancient legends of spirit caps that could bridge the gap between worlds, that could reveal hidden truths or twist the mind into unimaginable shapes. But these were tales, surely bedtime stories to keep children away from dangerous patches in the deep woods. Yet here they were, undeniably real, radiating a strange, compelling energy. Hesitantly, Ilara gathered a few, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt an instinctual pull, a primal curiosity that overshadowed her ingrained fear of the unknown. Back in her small cottage, she carefully dried one, grinding it into a fine powder. She didn't dare consume it herself, not yet. The legends warned of great risk, of minds lost to the ethereal realm. Instead, she offered a tiny pinch to a stray dog, an old hound named Barley, that often wandered into her yard. Barley, usually lethargic, perked up after sniffing the powder, his tail wagging with surprising vigor. He then spent the rest of the day chasing butterflies that weren't there, barking at shadows, and nuzzling Ilara's hand with an unusual, almost knowing affection. It was a small effect, but enough to confirm her suspicions. These were not ordinary mushrooms. News of the glowing mushrooms, whispered from villager to villager, eventually reached the ears of a minor noble, Lord Valerius. He was a greedy, superstitious man, always seeking an advantage, a shortcut to power. He had heard tales of witches and sorcerers in the forest, and these strange fungi fit perfectly into his twisted worldview. He saw not food but a tool. He saw not nature's mystery but a weapon. Lord Valerius, eager to curry favor with the king, and perhaps gain a strategic upper hand over his rival nobles, immediately dispatched his men to Oakhaven. They arrived with clanking armor and harsh commands, disrupting the peaceful village life. Ilara was quickly identified as the one who knew of the glowing fungi. Under duress, she led them to the patch, her heart heavy with dread. She knew with a sinking certainty that once these mushrooms left the forest, their purpose would be warped, their natural magic twisted by human greed. King Thuron, when presented with the glowing fungi by Lord Valerius, was intrigued but skeptical. He wasn't one for peasant superstitions. "What good are these trinkets, Valerius?" He boomed, prodding a violet glowing cap with his mailed finger. "Are they to light my banquet hall? I have enough torches." Lord Valerius, a man skilled in flattery and manipulation, bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, these are no mere trinkets. They are said to grant visions, insights, and even an understanding of the hearts of men. The forest folk speak of them in hushed tones, believing them to be gifts from ancient spirits." He embellished the truth, knowing the king's hidden insecurity about his own sagacity. The king, despite his outward bravado, harbored a deep paranoia. He suspected betrayal everywhere amongst his courtiers, his generals, even his own family. The idea of a substance that could reveal truth, that could pierce the veil of deception, was too tempting to resist. He ordered the fungi to be taken to his royal alchemist, Master Alaric, a gaunt, secretive man who dabbled in both medicine and darker arts. Alaric, a scholar of ancient texts and forbidden lore, recognized the fungi immediately. He had read of the dream weavers in dusty tomes, powerful entheogens capable of profoundly altering perception. He also knew of the severe risks, madness, vivid hallucinations, and even death if misused. But he served the king, and the king's command was absolute. Under the king's watchful eye, Alaric began to experiment. He first tried tiny doses on condemned prisoners. One man, a petty thief, after consuming a small amount, began to weep uncontrollably, confessing every minor transgression of his life, his mind awash in guilt. Another, a rebellious serf, spoke in riddles for days, describing fantastical beasts and impossible landscapes, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to come from within. The king was both fascinated and disturbed. This was powerful. This was dangerous. This could be useful. The king saw not truth, but control. He imagined a world where his enemies would confess their plots, where his peasants would reveal their rebellious thoughts, where loyalty could be confirmed not by oath, but by mushroom-induced revelation. He began to administer small, controlled doses to his closest advisors, observing their reactions, searching for signs of disloyalty in their babbling confessions. Some became docile, others paranoid. A few sank into deep melancholic states. The court of Stonehaven slowly began to shift, a subtle madness creeping in, nurtured by the glowing fungi. Queen Isolde watched these developments with a cold, calculating gaze. She saw her husband transforming, his paranoia escalating, his judgments becoming increasingly erratic. She knew the power of the mushrooms, not from legend, but from her own secret investigations. She had sent her own scouts to Oakhaven, learning of Ilara and the true, volatile nature of the spirit caps. She understood that while they might reveal fragments of truth, they also fractured the mind, making people susceptible to suggestion, easily manipulated. One day, a new law was decreed by King Thuron, an unprecedented act of cruelty that sent shivers through the kingdom. All citizens, from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble, would be required to consume a truth draft at the annual Feast of Allegiance. Those who refused would be branded as traitors and executed. The draft, of course, was derived from the glowing mushrooms. The rationale, as proclaimed by the king's heralds, was to ensure unwavering loyalty and purity of heart within the kingdom. But the true intent was clear: to crush any spark of rebellion, to eliminate any whisper of dissent before it could even form. Fear gripped Eldoria. Peasants spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously. Nobles began to plot, not against the king, but against each other, unsure whom they could trust, knowing their own secrets might soon be laid bare. Ilara, back in Oakhaven, heard of the king's decree with a heavy heart. She knew the true horror of what the fungi could do, the way they could strip a person of their sanity, leaving them vulnerable, broken. She felt responsible, a silent burden weighing on her soul for having first discovered them. She knew she had to act. She decided to seek an audience with Queen Isolde, a perilous journey for a peasant girl. She had heard whispers of the queen's quiet strength, her intelligence that far surpassed the king's bombastic nature. Through a network of sympathetic merchants and foresters, Ilara managed to deliver a message to one of the queen's trusted ladies-in-waiting, requesting a private meeting. To Ilara's surprise, the queen granted it. In a dimly lit chamber within Stonehaven, away from prying eyes and ears, Ilara met Queen Isolde. The queen, though regal, listened with an intensity that surprised the young peasant. Ilara spoke of the true nature of the fungi, the fragmented visions, the potential for madness, the way it could be manipulated to create false truths, to sow discord and suspicion. She explained how prolonged use, or high doses, could irrevocably damage the mind. Queen Isolde, already aware of much of this, listened to Ilara's first-hand knowledge with keen interest. She revealed her own concerns, her fear for the kingdom's future under the king's mushroom-fueled paranoia. "The king believes he is seeing truth, child," the queen said, her voice a low whisper. "But he is merely seeing what the fungi show him, what his own fears project onto their visions. His mind is becoming a labyrinth of shadows." Together, they began to formulate a plan. It was audacious, dangerous and risked everything. They would not try to stop the Feast of Allegiance, for that would be seen as an act of rebellion. Instead, they would use the very tool the king sought to wield against him. The Feast of Allegiance arrived, a grand and terrifying spectacle. The great hall of Stonehaven was adorned with banners and tapestries, but a palpable tension hung in the air, heavier than the scent of roasted boar. King Thuron, seated on his throne, watched with a glint in his eye as the royal alchemist Alaric prepared the truth drafts. These were small, ornate chalices, each filled with a pale, shimmering liquid, infused with the essence of the glowing mushrooms. One by one, nobles and prominent citizens were called forward to drink. Some trembled, others tried to maintain a stoic facade, but fear was etched on every face. As each person drank, the king scrutinized them, looking for any twitch, any stumble, any sign of hidden treachery. The effects varied. Some began to babble inconsequential secrets. Others grew tearful, confessing minor grievances. The king reveled in their discomfort, believing he was cleansing his kingdom of deceit. When it was the turn of the royal family, Queen Isolde stepped forward with a serene expression. She held her chalice aloft, meeting the king's gaze with an unreadable calm, then drank the draught in a single, deliberate gulp. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. She stood still for a moment, her breath catching. Then slowly, deliberately, Queen Isolde began to speak. Her voice, usually soft, now resonated through the silent hall, clear and ringing. "My king," she began, "the truth draft works its magic. It shows me a world of deceit, of betrayal. A world where a king, blinded by his own fear, allows the very tools of truth to become instruments of his undoing." The king shifted uneasily on his throne, his brow furrowed. "What nonsense is this, Isolde? Are you speaking of my enemies?" "No, my king," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I speak of the shadows that cling to your own heart. I see your paranoia, fueled by this very draft, turning your loyal subjects into quivering wretches. I see you, my husband, becoming a tyrant not of strength, but of terror, a puppet of your own dark suspicions. And I see the truth, the true purpose of this feast, not to reveal loyalty, but to crush the spirit of Eldoria, to break its people until they are nothing but empty shells." A gasp rippled through the hall. The king roared silence. "Guards, seize her. She is mad. The draft has twisted her mind." But the guards hesitated. The queen's words, spoken with such conviction, had struck a chord. Many had privately harbored the same fears, the same observations of the king's increasingly erratic behavior. This wasn't the babbling confession of a guilty mind. This was an accusation, delivered with chilling clarity. Just then, Elara, who had been hidden among the servants, stepped forward. She held a small, withered mushroom cap. "Your Majesty," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady, "the Queen speaks the truth. These fungi, the spirit caps, they do not show pure truth. They amplify what is already within. They prey on fears, on hidden desires, on deep-seated insecurities. For a mind like the Queen's, clear and resolute, they might reveal harsh realities. But for a mind consumed by suspicion and fear, like yours, my king, they will show only more fear, more suspicion, until the line between reality and nightmare is utterly blurred." The king, his face purpling with rage, struggled to process this. He looked from the defiant queen to the brave peasant girl, then to his hesitant guards. His own mind, clouded by months of subtle mushroom exposure, was already teetering on the edge. The queen's words, instead of being dismissed as madness, began to echo the very paranoia that the fungi had nurtured within him. Was she right? Was he truly being consumed by his own fears? The truth draft, meant to control others, was now turning against him, forcing him to confront his own inner demons. His vision swam. The tapestries on the walls seemed to writhe. The faces of his courtiers distorted into grotesque, accusing masks. He saw the years of injustice, the cruelty he had inflicted, the lives he had crushed, all flashing before his eyes, magnified and horrifying. The truth the mushrooms had offered him was not of his subjects' betrayal, but of his own monstrous actions, amplified and inescapable. The king screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He clutched his head, his crown askew, his eyes wide and vacant. He began to babble, not confessions of others, but his own darkest thoughts, his petty jealousies, his tyrannical desires laid bare for all to hear. He saw phantom snakes coiling around his feet, imagined the walls closing in, and believed his own loyal guards were preparing to strike him down. The court watched in stunned silence as King Thuron, the mighty ruler of Eldoria, descended into a screaming, sobbing wreck of a man, consumed by his own amplified fears. The very tool he had sought to control others had utterly broken him. It was a spectacle of tragic irony, a ruler undone by his own paranoia, and the misguided belief that he could command the delicate, dangerous magic of the natural world. In the ensuing chaos, Queen Isolde, with the quiet support of her loyalists and the now shaken court, quickly took charge. She declared the king unfit to rule, citing his complete mental incapacitation. The truth draft decree was immediately abolished. Alaric, the royal alchemist, was imprisoned for his role in administering the dangerous fungi, though his knowledge was later used to develop antidotes and treatments for those afflicted. Lord Valerius, who had first brought the mushrooms to the king, was stripped of his titles and exiled, a victim of his own opportunistic greed. Ilara, the peasant girl, was hailed as a heroine, her wisdom and courage recognized by the new queen. Isolde, now queen regent, began to rule Eldoria with a different philosophy. She fostered a court based on trust, not fear. The use of the glowing mushrooms was strictly forbidden, their collection punishable by severe penalties. The spirit caps returned to being a whispered legend, a reminder of a dark chapter, and a cautionary tale of unchecked power and the danger of twisting nature's gifts for selfish ends. The kingdom of Eldoria slowly healed. The peasants, once living in fear, found a measure of peace. The nobles learned humility, understanding that true power lay not in crushing dissent, but in earning loyalty. Mushrooms, once a simple food, then a tool of tyranny, settled back into their role in the lives of the common folk, appreciated for their earthy goodness, but forever shrouded in the quiet reverence that came from knowing their deeper, more perilous secrets. The moral of the story, whispered in the quiet forests and bustling markets of Eldoria for generations to come, was simple. Power, when sought through manipulation and fear, is a fragile thing. And sometimes, the most profound truths are found not in forced confessions, but in the quiet courage of those who dare to speak up, even when faced with unimaginable tyranny. The forest held its secrets, and Eldoria learned at great cost that some things are best left simply as food. The memory of King Thuron's downfall, a spectacle of madness fueled by his own paranoia, lingered like a chilling mist over Eldoria. Queen Isolde, now the undisputed ruler, faced the daunting task of stitching a fractured kingdom back together. The nobles, still reeling from the Feast of Allegiance, were a mixture of relief and lingering suspicion. The peasants, though freed from the immediate terror of the truth draft, carried the scars of fear and injustice deep within their hearts. Isolde, however, was not her husband. She understood that true power lay not in crushing dissent, but in fostering trust and healing wounds. Her first act was to establish a royal council, not of sycophants, but of wise men and women chosen for their integrity and judgment, regardless of their noble lineage. Among them, to the astonishment of many, was Ilara, the peasant girl from Oakhaven. Isolde recognized Ilara's unique wisdom, her deep understanding of the natural world, and her unwavering courage. Ilara was given the title of royal herbalist and advisor, a position that blurred the ancient lines between commoner and noble, a bold move that signaled a new era. The castle of Stonehaven, once a symbol of tyrannical fear, slowly began to transform. The grim dungeons, where so many had suffered under Thuron's cruel laws, were emptied and repurposed. Some sections were even converted into libraries and healing centers, a stark contrast to their previous use. Isolde commissioned scholars and healers to study the remaining spirit caps, not for their truth-revealing properties, but to understand their medicinal applications and, more importantly, to develop effective antidotes for those still suffering from their lingering effects. Alaric, the former royal alchemist, his mind sharpened by his own imprisonment and remorse, surprisingly proved invaluable in this endeavor. He worked tirelessly, driven by a desire to atone for his unwitting complicity in the king's madness. But healing a kingdom was a slow, arduous process. The memory of odd laws, like the Truth Draft Decree, or the lesser-known but equally cruel Whisper Ban that had outlawed any private conversation exceeding 3 minutes among peasants, still haunted the common folk. Under Thuron, even a casual chat could be twisted into a treasonous plot, and suspected violations were met with public floggings. The arbitrary nature of justice under his rule had bred deep-seated distrust, making it difficult for people to believe in a benevolent ruler. Queen Isolde actively worked to dismantle these cruelties. She sent royal emissaries throughout the kingdom, not with decrees of punishment, but with messages of reassurance. They brought aid to famine-stricken villages, established fair courts where commoners could seek justice against unscrupulous nobles, and abolished all unjust taxes and forced labor. One of her most celebrated reforms was the Forest Decree, which granted peasants certain rights to gather resources from the royal forests without fear of arbitrary punishment, a direct reversal of Thuron's draconian hunting and gathering laws that had often led to peasants being tortured for poaching a rabbit. This period of transition, though marked by hope, was not without its challenges. Some of the old, arrogant nobles, accustomed to their unchecked power, resisted Isolde's reforms. They saw her compassion as weakness, her reforms as an erosion of their rightful privileges. A particularly vocal opponent was Duke Randall, a man known for his vast landholdings and his particularly harsh treatment of his serfs. Randall openly sneered at Ilara's presence on the council, calling it an insult to the noble bloodline. Duke Randall, clinging to the old ways, continued to enforce his own brutal laws on his estates, defying the Queen's new mandates. He maintained his private dungeons, where peasants were often tortured for trivial offenses, or merely to satisfy his sadistic whims. Whispers of these continued abuses reached Queen Isolde, who understood that her new reign's legitimacy hinged on her ability to curb such defiance. Isolde decided to make an example, but not with the swift, brutal force her husband would have employed. She sought justice, not vengeance. She dispatched a royal commission, led by Ilara, to investigate Duke Randall's estate. Ilara, with her quiet authority and deep understanding of the common folk, gathered testimonies from Randall's suffering serfs, documenting the extent of his cruelty, the arbitrary punishments, the prolonged tortures in his dungeons. When the evidence was undeniable, Queen Isolde summoned Duke Randall to Stonehaven. In a public trial, before the newly constituted royal court, Ilara presented the detailed accounts of Randall's abuses. The Duke, arrogant and defiant, scoffed at the testimony, dismissing the serfs as lying wretches. He even dared to mock Ilara, calling her a forest mushroom who had no place in matters of state. But Isolde, with a calm authority that brooked no argument, heard the evidence. She pronounced Randall guilty of gross injustice, of defying royal decrees, and of crimes against the people of Eldoria. His lands were confiscated, his titles stripped, and he was sentenced not to death, but to spend the rest of his days working alongside the very serfs he had brutalized, forced to experience the harsh realities of the life he had so casually inflicted upon others. It was a punishment more fitting, more poetic than any execution, for it forced him to confront the consequences of his own cruelty. The downfall of Duke Randall sent a clear message throughout the kingdom. The days of unchecked noble power and arbitrary cruelty were over. Isolde's justice was firm but fair, a stark contrast to Thuron's capricious tyranny. This act solidified the Queen Regent's authority and began to slowly restore faith in the crown. The kingdom flourished under Queen Isolde's gentle but firm hand. Trade routes reopened, villages rebuilt, and the arts and sciences, stifled under Thuron's paranoid rule, began to thrive again. Ilara, the royal herbalist, dedicated herself to studying the beneficial properties of other forest plants, developing new medicines, and expanding the knowledge of natural healing. The spirit caps, while still strictly forbidden for consumption, were now understood as a powerful symbol, a reminder of how something seemingly innocuous could be twisted into a tool of oppression, and how easily power could corrupt. The children of Eldoria grew up hearing the tale of King Thuron, the mushrooms that twisted his mind, and the queen who brought light back to the kingdom. It became a cautionary tale, whispered around hearth fires, a lesson about the dangers of arrogance, the intoxicating lure of absolute power, and the importance of empathy and justice. They learned that true strength lay not in domination, but in understanding, not in control, but in compassion. And so, mushrooms in Eldoria returned to their place beyond the dinner plate, yet forever changed. They were no longer just food, but a living reminder of a time when their silent power had almost undone a kingdom. They symbolized the hidden depths of nature, capable of both sustenance and peril, and a mirror to the human soul itself, capable of both great good and terrible darkness. The lesson resonated through generations. Even the most humble of things can become a catalyst for immense change, and sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones we refuse to see within ourselves. The quiet wisdom of the forest, once ignored by kings, had spoken, and Eldoria had finally listened, choosing a path of hope and humanity over fear and tyranny. The journey was long, the wounds deep, but the sun, at last, truly shone upon a kingdom reborn, guided by a queen who understood that true leadership meant serving, not merely ruling.